Theodore Robert Bundy, also known as Ted Bundy, was born Theodore Robert Caldwell on November 24, 1946. Ted Bundy was an American serial killer, kidnapper, rapist, burglar, and necrophile who assaulted and murdered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s and possibly earlier. After more than a decade of denials, he confessed to 30 homicides that he had committed in 7 states between 1974 in 1978. The true number of victims is unknown. Many of Bundy's young female victims regarded him as handsome and charismatic, which were traits he exploited to win their trust. He would typically approach them in public places, feigning injury or disability or impersonating an authority figure before overpowering and assaulting them in secluded locations. He sometimes revisited his crime scenes, grooming and performing sexual acts with the decomposing corpses. He decapitated at least 12 victims and kept some of the severed heads as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, he broke into dwellings at night and bludgeoned his victims as they slept. In 1975, Ted Bundy was jailed for the first time when he was incarcerated in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in multiple states. Facing murder charges in Colorado, he engineered 2 dramatic escapes and committed further assaults, including 3 murders, before his ultimate recapture in Florida in 1978. For the Florida homicides, he received 3 death sentences and 2 separate trials. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. Biographer Ann Rule described Bundy as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims to the point of death and even after. Ted Bundy once called himself the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. Attorney Polly Nelson, a member of his last defense team, wrote that he was the very definition of heartless evil. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, to Eleanor Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His father's identity was never determined with any degree of certainty. His birth certificate assigned paternity to a salesman and Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall. But Louise later claimed that she had been seduced by a sailor whose name may have been Jack Worthington. Years later, investigators would find no record of anyone by that name in the Navy or Merchant Marine archives. Some family members expressed suspicion that Bundy might have been fathered by Louise's own violent, abusive father, Samuel Cowell, but no material evidence has ever been cited to support or refute this. For the first 3 years of Ted Bundy's life, he lived in a Philadelphia home with his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Caldwell, who raised him as their own son to avoid the social stigma that accompanied birth outside of wedlock. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. He eventually discovered the truth, although he had varied recollections of the circumstances. He told a girlfriend that a cousin showed him a copy of his birth certificate after calling him a bastard, but he told biographer that he found the certificate himself. The biographer and true crime writer Ann Rule, who knew Bundy personally, believed that he did not find out until 1969 when he located his original birth record in Vermont. Ted Bundy expressed a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father and for leaving him to discover his true parentage for himself. In some interviews, Bundy spoke warmly of his grandparents, and he told Ann Rule that he identified with, respected, and clung to his grandfather. In 1987, however, he and other family members told an attorney that Samuel Caldwell was a tyrant, a bully, and a bigot who hated blacks, Italians, Catholics, and Jews. Bundy's grandfather beat his wife and the family dog and swung neighborhood cats by their tails. He once threw Louise's younger sister Julie down a flight of stairs for sleeping. He sometimes spoke out loud to unseen presences, and at least once he flew into a violent rage when he questioned Ted Bundy's paternity, who was Ted's dad. Ted also described his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression, and she feared to leave their house towards the end of her life. Ted Bundy occasionally exhibited disturbing behavior even at an early age. Um, Julia recalled awakening one day from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the Caldwell kitchen. Her 3-year-old nephew, Ted Bundy, was standing by the bed and smiling. In 1950, Louise changed her surname from Caldwell to Nelson, and at the urging of multiple family members, she left Philadelphia with her son to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpeper Bundy, a hospital cook, at an adults singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They married later that year, and Johnny Bundy formally adopted Ted. Johnny and Louise conceived 4 children of their own, although Johnny tried to include his adoptive son in camping trips and other family activities. Ted remained distant. He later complained to his girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father, wasn't very bright, and didn't make much money. Ted had different recollections of Tacoma when he spoke to his biographers. When he talked to Michaud and Ainsworth, he described how he roamed his neighborhood, picking through trash barrels in search of pictures of naked women. When he spoke to Polly Nelson, he explained how he pursued detective magazines, crime novels, and true crime documentaries for stories that involved sexual violence, particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures of dead or maimed bodies. In a letter to Rule, he asserted that he never ever read fact detective magazines and shrouded at the thought that anybody would. In his conversations with Michaud, he described how he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or whatever else could be seen. Ted Bundy also varied the accounts of his social life. He told Michaud and Ainsworth that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He claimed that he had no natural sense of how to develop a friendship. And he is quoted as saying, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what underlay social interactions." But classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School told Ann Rule, however, that Ted Bundy was well known and well liked there, and he was a medium sized fish in a large pond. And downhill skiing was Ted Bundy's only significant athletic avocation. He enthusiastically pursued the activity by using stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During high school, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. When he reached the age of 18, the details of the incident were expunged from his record, which is customary in Washington. After graduating from high school in 1965, Ted Bundy spent a year at the University of Puget Sound before he transferred to the University of Washington in 1966 to study Chinese. In 1967, he became romantically involved with a university classmate who is identified by several in Bundy's biographies, most commonly Stephanie Brooks. In early 1968, he dropped out of the college and worked at a series of minimum wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington State. In August of that year, Ted Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as a Rockefeller delegate. Shortly Shortly thereafter, Brooks ended their relationship and returned to her family home in California, frustrated by what she described as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis would later pinpoint this crisis as probably the pivotal time in his development. Devastated by Brooks' rejection, Bundy traveled to Colorado and then farther east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia and enrolling for one semester at Temple University. It was at this time in early 1969, Ann Rule believes, that Bundy visited the Office of Birth Records in Burlington and confirmed his true parentage. Bundy was back in Washington in the fall of 1969, where he met Elizabeth Klopfer, and she worked as a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Their stormy relationship would continue past his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. In mid 1970, Bundy was now focused and goal oriented, and he enrolled at the University of Washington again, this time as a psychology major. He became an honor student and was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, where he met and worked alongside of Ann Rule. Ann Rule was a former Seattle police officer and an aspiring crime writer who would later go on to write a great book about Ted Bundy called The Stranger Beside Me. When Ann Rule worked beside of Bundy, she said that she saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time, and he was very social and very empathetic. After graduating from UW in 1972, Ted Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign. Posing as a college student, he shadowed Evans' opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, and recorded his stump speeches for analysis by Evans' team. After Evans was reelected, Ted Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis thought well of Ted Bundy and described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. In early 1973, Bundy was accepted into law school. He got into law school on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several other UW psychology professors. During a trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, Ted Bundy rekindled his relationship with Brooks, who marveled at his transformation into a serious, dedicated professional who was seemingly on the cusp of a distinguished legal and political career. He continued to date Klopfer as well, and neither woman was aware of the other's existence. In the fall of 1973, Bundy matriculated at UPS Law School and continued courting Brooks, who flew to Seattle several times to stay with him. They discussed marriage, and at one point, he introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. In January 1974, however, he abruptly broke off all contact. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned. Finally reaching him by phone a month later, Brooks demanded to know why Bundy was ending their relationship without an explanation. In a flat, calm voice, he replied, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. He later explained, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have had her and married her." But Brooks concluded in retrospect that he had deliberately planned the entire courtship and rejection in advance as vengeance for the breakup she initiated in 1968. By then, Bundy had begun skipping classes at law school. By April, he had stopped attending entirely as young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. The year the murders began, he was the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, and he actually wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Much later, Bundy would joke with Utah newsmen that after his 8 weeks in Salt Lake City's jail system, before being released on bail, he had had a valuable experience for studying the law, giving him new insight into improving the criminal justice system. His first order of action was to focus on addressing the bail bond system and improving it. There is no consensus on when or where Bundy began killing women. He told different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he confessed in graphic detail to dozens of later murders in the days preceding his execution. He told Nelson that he attempted his first kidnapping in 1969 in Ocean City, New Jersey, but did not kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. He told psychologist Art Norman that he killed two women in Atlantic City in 1969 while visiting family in Philadelphia. He hinted but refused to elaborate to homicide detective Robert D. Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in 1972 and another murder in 1973 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater. Rule and Keppel both believed that he might have started killing as a teenager. Circumstantial evidence suggested that he abducted and killed 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr of Tacoma when she was 14 years old in 1961. There was an allegation that was an allegation he repeatedly denied. His earliest documented homicides were committed in 1974 when he was 27 years old. By his own admission, he had mastered the necessary skills in the era before DNA profiling to leave minimal incriminating forensic evidence at the crime scene. Shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, around the same time that he terminated his relationship with Brooks, Bundy entered the apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks. And he took a metal rod from her bed frame and hit her with it and beat her with it. He sexually assaulted her with the same rod, causing extensive internal injury. She remained unconscious for 10 days but survived with permanent physical and mental disabilities. In the early morning hours of February 1st, Ted Bundy broke into the basement room of Lydia Ann Healy, a UW undergraduate who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and a boots, and carried her away. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about one per month. On March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, 60 miles southwest of Seattle, left her dormitory room to attend a jazz concert on campus, but never arrived. On April 17th, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, 110 miles east southeast of Seattle. Two female Central Washington students later come forward to report encounters, one on the night of Rancourt's disappearance, the other 3 nights earlier, with a man wearing an arm sling asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University, 85 miles away, and it's south of Portland, to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but she never arrived. Detectives from the King County and Seattle police departments grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common, apart from being young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern near Seattle Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown haired man with his arm in a sling. In the early hours of June 11th, UW student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing. After Hawkins' disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man that night who was in the alley behind a nearby dormitory. He was on crutches with a leg cast and was struggling to carry a briefcase. One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. During this period, Ted Bundy was working in Olympia at the Department of Emergency Services, a state government agency involved in the search for missing women. There he met and dated Carol Ann Boone, a twice divorced mother of two, who 6 years later would play an important role in the final phase of his life. Reports of the six missing women and Sparks' brutal beating appeared in newspapers and on television shows throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on the law enforcement agencies. They had little physical evidence. Police could not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Further similarities between the victims were noted. The disappearances all took place at night, usually near ongoing construction work within a week of midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans, and at most crime scenes there was a sighting of a man wearing a cast or sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Pacific Northwest murders culminated on July 14th with the broad daylight abductions of two women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish, 20 miles east of Seattle. Five female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a tennis outfit with his arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British, introducing himself as Ted. He asked for their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze colored Volkswagen Beetle. Four refused. One accompanied him as far as his car, saw there was no sailboat, and fled. Three additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Ott, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Ted Bundy told Stephen Michaud that Ott was still alive when he returned with Naslund and that he forced one to watch the other as he murdered, but he later denied it in an interview with Lewis on the eve of his execution. The King County Police were finally provided with a detailed description of the suspect in his car when they posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Elizabeth Koffler, an Ann Rule, and DES employee and a UW psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car and reported Ted Bundy as the possible suspect. But detectives who were receiving up to 200 tips per day thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record would be the perpetrator. On September 6, two grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Ott and Naslund near a service road, 2 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. An extra femur and several vertebrae were found at the site and identified by Bundy as Georgianne Hawkins. 6 months later, students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls of Healy Rancourt Park's Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Ted Bundy frequently hiked just east of where Manson's remains were recovered. In August 1974, Ted Bundy received a second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer in Seattle. While he called her often, he dated at least a dozen other women. When he studied the first year curriculum a second time, he was devastated to find out that the other students had some intellectual capacity that he did not. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. It was a great disappointment to me, he stated. A new string of homicides began the following month, including two that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to them shortly before his execution. On September 2nd, he raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then either disposed of the remains immediately in a nearby river or returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. On October 2nd, he seized 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City, and dragged her into a wooded area intended to de escalate his pathological urges, he claimed, by raping and then releasing her. But he strangled her accidentally, he said, in the process of trying to silence her screams. Her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, some 200 miles south of Holiday, but were never found. October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief of Midvale, another Salt Lake City suburb, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor. Her nude body was found in the nearby mountain area 9 days later. Postmortem examination indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On October 31st, Lorianne Aim, also 17, disappeared 25 miles south. After leaving a cafe just after midnight, her naked body was found by hikers 9 miles to the northeast in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day. Both women had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Ted described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and Aim, including hair shampooing and application of makeup. In the late afternoon of November 8th, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol DeRonch at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, less than a mile from Midvale restaurant where Melissa Smith was last seen. He identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told her that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. When she pointed out to Ted that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station, he immediately pulled to the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During the struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and she was able to open the car door and escape. Later that evening, Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, 20 miles north of Murray, disappeared after leaving a theater production to go pick up her brother. The school's drama teacher and a student told police that a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car. Another student later saw the same man pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him again shortly before the end of the play. Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Carol DeRonch's wrist. In November, Elizabeth Klopfer called King County Police a second time after she read that young women were now disappearing in towns surrounding Salt Lake City. The detective of the Major Crimes Division interviewed her in detail. By then, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County hierarchy of suspicion. But the Lake Samowish witnesses considered most reliable by detectives failed to identify him from a photo lineup. In December, Klopfer called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and repeated her suspicions. Bundy's name was added to their list of suspects, but at the time, no credible evidence linked him to the Utah crimes. In January 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle after his final exams and spent a week with Klopfer, who did not tell him that she had reported him to police on 3 separate occasions. She made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. In 1975, Bundy shifted much of his criminal activity eastward from his base in Utah to Colorado. On January 12th, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Willwood Inn. And that is in Snowmass Village, 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road just outside the resort. She had been killed by blows to her head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive groove depressions on her skull. Her body also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon. On March 15th, 100 miles northeast of Snowmass, a ski instructor named Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help him carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed her and handcuffed her, then assaulted and strangled her at a secondary site near Rifle, 90 miles west. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to revisit her remains. Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25, disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6 while riding her bicycle to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were found under a nearby railroad bridge. On May 6, Bundy lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles north of Salt Lake City. He drowned and then sexually assaulted her in his hotel room before disposing of her body in a river north of Pocatello, possibly the Snake. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's Washington State DES co-workers, including Carol Ann Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed for a week in his apartment. Bundy subsequently spent a week in Seattle with Klopfer in early June, and they discussed getting married the following Christmas. Again, Klopfer made no mention of her multiple discussions with the King County Police and the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, and Bundy disclosed neither his ongoing relationship with Boone nor a concurrent romance with a Utah law student known in various accounts as Kim Andrews. On June 28, Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Birmingham Young University, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Curtis' murder became Bundy's last confession, taped recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Ollerson, Culver, Curtis were never recovered. In August or September of 1975, Ted Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Although he was not an active participant in services and ignored most church restrictions, he would later be excommunicated by the LDS Church following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. When asked his religious preference after his arrest, Bundy answered Methodist, the religion of his childhood. Washington state investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended as abruptly as it began. In an effort to make sense of an overwhelming mass of data, they resorted to the innovative strategy of compiling a database. They used the King County payroll computer, a huge primitive machine by contemporary standards, but the only one available for their use. After inputting the many lists that they had compiled, classmates and acquaintances of each victim, and the Volkswagen owner's name Ted, known sex offenders, and so on, the computer looked for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 separate lists. One was Ted Bundy. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and Bundy was on that list as well. He was literally at the top of the pile of suspects when word came from the Utah arrest. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger, another Salt Lake City suburb. Hayward had observed Bundy cruising a residential area in the pre-dawn hours. Bundy fled the area at a high speed after seeing the patrol car. The officer searched the car after he noticed that the Volkswagen front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats. He found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bag, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing. He had found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect in a car description from the November 1974 De Ranch kidnapping, which matched Bundy's name from Klopfer's December 1974 phone call. In a search of Bundy's apartment, police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a check mark by the Willwood Inn, and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Deborah Kent had disappeared. The police did not have significant evidence to detain Bundy, and he was released on his own recognizance. Bundy later said the searchers missed a collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims. He destroyed the photographs after he was released. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with two other detectives to interview Klopfer. She told them that in the year prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that she couldn't understand in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply house, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects include surgical gloves and Oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Bundy was in debt, and Klopfer suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anybody, I'll break your effing neck." She said Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers with a flashlight, examining her body. He kept a lug wrench taped halfway up the handle in the trunk of her car, another Volkswagen Beetle, which he often borrowed for protection. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Klopfer on any of the nights during which the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished, nor on the day Ott and Naslund were abducted. Shortly thereafter, Klopfer was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney, and learned of the existence of Stephanie Brooks on her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas of 1973. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it. They found hairs matching samples obtained from Karen Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands microscopically indistinguishable from those of Melissa Smith and Carol DeRonch. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching three different victims who had never met one another would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2nd, detectives put Bundy into a lineup. DeRonch immediately identified him as Officer Roseland. In the same lineup, witnesses from Bountiful picked him as the stranger who lurked about the high school auditorium. There was insignificant evidence to link him to Deborah Kent, but there was more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping, attempted criminal assault in the DeRonch case. He was freed on $15,000 bail paid by his parents, and he spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle living in Klopfer's house. Seattle police had insignificant evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. "When Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere," Klopfer wrote, "so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. In November, the three principal Bundy investigators, Jerry Thomas from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado, and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. While officials left the meeting convinced that Bundy was the murderer they sought, they agreed that more hard evidence would be needed before he could be charged with any of the murders. On February 23, 1976, Ted Bundy stood trial for the DeRonch kidnapping. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, Bundy waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. On March 1st, after a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hanson Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. On June 30th, he was sentenced to serve a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 15 years in Utah State Prison. In October, he was found hiding in the bushes in the prison yard carrying an escape kit road maps, airline schedules, and a Social Security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Karen Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney, and as such, he was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse library to research his case. Ted concealed himself behind a bookcase, and he opened a window and jumped from the second story, springing his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, he walked through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts. Then he hiked southward onto Aspen Mountain. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. The following day, he left the cabin and continued south towards the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days, he wandered aimlessly on the mountain, missing two trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, he broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, taking food and ski supplies, but instead of continuing southward, he walked back north towards Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of Aspen Golf Course. Cold, sleep deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, he drove back into Aspen, where two police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as pretrial motions consistently resolved in his favor, and significant bits of evidence were ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant might have realized that he stood a good chance of acquittal, and beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors. With little as a year and a half to serve on the DeRanch conviction, um, Ted would have been a free man if he would have just stayed put. Instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates, and he accumulated $500 in cash smuggled in over a 6-month period, he later said, by visitors, Carol Ann Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, he sawed a hole about 1 foot square between the steel reinforcement bars in his cell ceiling. Having lost 35 pounds, he was able to wiggle through into the crawl space above. In the weeks that followed, he made a series of practice runs exploring the space. Multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. On the night of December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and non-violent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy piled books and files on his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles to the east. From there, he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. In Glenwood Springs, the jail skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago. Ted traveled from Chicago by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. There on January 2nd, in a local tavern, he watched his alma mater, UW, defeat Michigan in the Rose Bowl. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus and arrived in Tallahassee, Florida on the morning of January 8th. He rented a room under the alias Chris Hagen at a boarding house near the Florida State University campus. Bundy later said he initially resolved to find legitimate employment and refrain from further criminal activity, knowing he could probably remain free and undetected in Florida indefinitely as long as he did not attract the attention of police. But his lone job application at a construction site had to be abandoned when he was asked to produce identification. He reverted to his old habits of shoplifting and stealing credit cards from women's wallets left in shopping carts. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, 1 week after his arrival in Tallahassee, Ted entered FSU's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. Beginning at about 2:45 a.m., he bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, 21, with a piece of oak firewood as she slept, then garroted her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Levy and beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples, bit deeply into her left buttocks, and sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. In an adjoining bedroom, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, breaking her jaw and deeply lacerating her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, broken jaw, loss of teeth, and a crushed finger. Kathy Kleiner, who described seeing only a silhouette of a man wielding a club, attributed her survival to the headlights of the car, bringing Nita Neary back to the house, which lit up Kleiner and Chandler's room. Tallahassee detectives later determined that the four attacks took place in a total of less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy broke into the basement apartment 8 blocks away and attacked FSU student Cheryl Thomas, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness and damage that ended her dance career. On Thompson's bed, police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs similar to Bundy's in class and characteristics. On February 8th, Bundy drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van. In a parking lot, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of a Jacksonville Police Department chief of detectives, identifying himself as Richard Burton Fire Department, but retreated when her older brother arrived and challenged him. That afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles westward to Lake City. At Lake City Junior High School the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an extensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Sewanee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. On February 12th, with no cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Ted stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by a Pensacola police officer, David Lee, near the Alabama state line after a wants and warrants check showed his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. When told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from underneath him and took off running. Lee fired a warning shot. By the second round, he gave chase and tackled him. The two struggled over Lee's gun before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle were three sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television set. Also were found was a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, later identified as the disguise worn by Richard Burton, the fire department guy in Jacksonville. As Lee transported his suspect to jail and aware he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy say, "I wish you had have killed me." Following a change of venue to Miami, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides and assaults in June 1979. The trial was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the United States. Despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy again handled much of his own defense. From the beginning, he sabotaged the entire defense effort out of spite, distrust, and delusion, Nelson later wrote. Ted was facing murder charges with the possibility of a death sentence, and all that mattered to him apparently was that he was in charge. On July 24, 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted for the Bowman and the Levy murders and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. The trial judge, Edward Cowart, imposed the death sentences for the murder conviction. 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach. Bundy was found guilty once again after less than 8 hours of deliberation, due principally to the testimony of an eyewitness who saw him leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van. Important material evidence, including clothing fibers with an unusual manufacturing error, found in the van and on Leach's body, which matched fibers from the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the penalty phase of the trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida law providing that a marriage declaration in court in the presence of a judge constituted a legal marriage. As he was questioning former Washington State DES co-worker Carol Ann Boone, he had moved to Florida to be near Bundy, had testified on his behalf during both trials also, and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness. He asked her to marry him. She accepted, and Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. On February 10, 1980, Bundy was sentenced for a 3rd time to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood up and shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." This 3rd death sentence would be the one ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. In October 1981, Boone gave birth to a daughter and named Bundy as the father. While conjugal visits were not allowed at Rayford Prison, inmates were known to pool their money in order to bribe guards to allow them intimate time alone with their female visitors. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was 42 years old, and the state of Florida carried out the execution of Ted Bundy, and he was put in the electric chair. And of course he died. And this is the end of the Ted Bundy story, guys. I hope you enjoyed listening to me read about Ted Bundy. If you did, give this video a thumbs up and leave me a comment below. Now, there's a lot of things about Ted Bundy that I didn't put in this video because you can see this is a very long video, but he did give some interviews to Hackmeyer before his execution. He was trying to get a stay of execution, I believe, but he did admit to at least 30 homicides, but they think there could possibly be a lot more. Thank you guys for watching.